So it's been quite a time trying to decide what to talk to you about today and how. I've considered talking to you about everything from how the NBA bubble enabled a more direct engagement with the Black Lives Matter movement, or how Adrian Mishler of YouTube's Yoga with Adrian, along with a host of other at-home fitness gurus, have taken physical culture routines and the people who do them back to their roots. And then I found a shift, quite by mistake, in my attempt to narrow down my scattered ideas about theater and sports in and after the pandemic. As I've done so many times, I Googled theater and sports out of desperation. I will tell you that I normally come back quite empty-handed from that desperate search. I typically get a smattering of sites that focus on what are called theater sports, right? Competitive improvisation games. I get a healthy dose of theater being used as a metaphor in sporting contexts. And then also a small helping of theater venues that have been converted into some kind of sports bar or fitness club. I'll confess that I also added pandemic to the search this time, so perhaps that was the difference, but I doubt it. I found so very many articles about how the pandemic has ravaged both sports and theater, what might be responsible for this shifting of affinities. So as I'll touch on a bit later in this talk, theater and sports have a long-standing history of tension. Each area likes to use the other as a negatively inflected metaphoric comparative tool by which to measure their own bad habits. I find this manifest frequently in my own theater students' general distaste for and distrust of sports and athletics. That's why, not unlike my surprise at my recent Google search, I was surprised when my students, made a connection between sports and theater in class recently. I was talking with them over Zoom, of course, about what their future in theater might look like in the after-COVID time. Without any prompting by me, sports person, they started talking about sports and how sports was making it work during the pandemic. And why couldn't theater just figure something out like sports did? The million-dollar question, really. After we went down several paths of conversation, money, how each area treats its players, who are the audiences, we landed on what this pressure cooker of the pandemic has illuminated about the precarious ties and long stewing tensions between sports and theater. I heard three main threads in our discussion. First, I heard envy there. Why can they play when we can't? Second, I heard the realization that the very real precarity of nonprofit theaters in the US, which constitute the majority of the industry, except for Broadway and dinner theaters, right, their situation is incredibly precarious. Third, I heard a rejuvenated fetishization of theater's liveness. And I will tell you that there is an entire paper there that I am not going to tell you about today. Finally, I added that I felt that the real loss that we all feel is really the lack of gathering, the lack of being together with people in a room and experiencing things. The core of what I feel it is that we as artists do. The relationship between sports and the performing arts has long been defined by affinities and oppositions. Of late, that relationship has seemed more tense than not, with both sides regularly and sometimes vociferously disavowing comparisons to the other. It seems both the performing arts and sports find association with the other to cast the seriousness of their own endeavors in doubt. Unsurprisingly, the global pandemic has forced a shift in that relationship. Globally, numerous news reports frame sports and the performing arts as perhaps two of the most ravaged arenas of the last year and beyond. In the US, where government financial support is measly, this decimation has resulted in many calling for a return of something like the Federal Theater Project, a post-Depression era program attached to the Workers' Progress Administration that funded theater units in multiple cities across the country to create and perform new work. Utilizing a framework of biopolitics, precarity, and necropolitics, I told you it would be wide-ranging, I propose that the pandemic has realigned the matrices of affinity between sports and the performing arts, specifically theater. The new landscape brings these two fields together around a central question. Where do we go from here? What should we take with us as we reemerge? By interrogating this question further, I hope that this talk might help us re-examine our fields around how both sports and theater might position themselves to be more just and equitable performance places as we move out of the global pandemic and towards a precarious future. Borrowing from Judith Butler's recent article focused on the problematic ideology of individualism, I suggest that theater and sports' reliance on collaboration and collectivity might help them lead us all toward a more just practice. As I've suggested elsewhere in my work, sports and physical culture have many connections to theater and performance. Both rely on collaboration in order to function and create their work, whether it's the veritable army of workers that support a professional sports team, or the trainers that guide me through CrossFit workouts, used to, at my local box. Truly solo work is rare. In theatrical terms, coaches function much like directors by overseeing the big picture of game preparation, managing all the people and pieces that support the game. On the other hand, athletes, similarly to actors, concentrate on their own role in the game. Whether it be a singles tennis match or an NFL, National Football League playoff game, athletes are focused on their mental and physical capacity to endure the stress of the game. Production structures between sports and theater also share commonalities. Teams in both fields spend countless hours in practice without an audience in order to prepare for a live performance in front of an audience. Most of the coaching directing happens in practice, and the athlete actors take center stage in the live performance in front of spectators. The work in both contexts requires mental discipline and physical stamina. The industries both favor youth, and athletes, just like actors, often need to rely on an alternative career path once their youthful physical stamina fades, or if they miss that lucky chance that catapults them to fame. The commonalities, especially between student athletes and student artists, both of whom spend all day with coursework and the majority of their evenings in practice, are so close that it amazes me sometimes that sports programs and art programs in schools and colleges don't spend more time talking to one another. And yet sports and the arts are often placed at odds with one another. As part of her inspiring call to action to the performing artists in her Lifetime Achievement Award acceptance speech at the 2017 Golden Globes, Meryl Streep drew a line in the sand between what Hollywood and the arts represent and the xenophobic values espoused by many in our previous administration in the US. Quote, "Hollywood is crawling with outsiders and foreigners," she declared. "If you kick them all out, you'll have nothing to watch but football and mixed martial arts, which are not the arts," unquote. In making this distinction, she also drew upon an assumed opposition between the performing arts and sports that I continually hope to trouble. While frequently positioned as fundamentally different from one another, sports and performance are also genealogically linked across times and geographies. Theater and sports have historically flirted with one another along a boundary of the aesthetics of difference. The origin stories of sport are very similar to those of theater, rooted in ritual and human behaviors like running and dancing, in the joy of moving one's body. Games developed out of a need for survival and moved into the realm of religious worship. For the Greeks, both practices contributed to the education of the polis, through the agon, where competition in theater, religion, and art were meant to sharpen the mind, and in sports, perfect the body. Sports and games have long kept soldiers battle ready, whether it's samurai practicing sumo or soldiers in marching drills. Sports have long been a way that humans enjoy leisure time. On the other hand, the stakes of sports and games have also had life and death consequences. Scholars speculate that the Aztec ball games, played at Tajin, ended with the losing team being sacrificed to the gods. Roman gladiatorial spectacles ended in the death of prisoner athletes, and Palestinian terrorists massacred 11 Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Games. In theater, Meyerhold, Artaud, Grotowski borrowed many of their techniques from physical training regimens practiced in gymnasiums and dance, and in cultures that were not their own, appropriating them for a Western context. Shifting to audience experience, Brecht suggests that theater spectatorship should be more akin to sports spectatorship in order to create audiences of experts rather than the culinary consumers that populated modern theaters. Today, we play out many of our social, cultural, and political dramas through sports. So how have these affinities shifted during the pandemic? Here's what the Google search found. First, an article on foreignpolicy.com, Culture Shock, 8 voices on the future of entertainment, culture, and sports. The article includes short pieces from folks in music, film, television, cricket, and the Olympics about their experiences during the pandemic and their hopes for the profession afterward. While all worry about the long-term economic impact, they also point to how this might force more ethical choices for athletes and artists in terms of their health. Second, a December blog in the British Medical Journal by physician Cameron Abbasi talks about sports and theater collectively as, quote, public entertainment. He lays the closings of theater and sporting venues at the feet of the UK government, suggesting that they limited these entertainments in ways that they did not similarly limit restaurants and clubs. He asks, quote, why was it beyond the ingenuity and determination of theater owners to stay open for longer with strict masking and distancing, especially in theaters with modern ventilation, unquote. Certainly in the US, this approach differed based on whether or not the venues were professional or amateur. Many amateur houses continued to stage shows, some with masked performers, some outside, sometimes having the actor volunteers merely sign waivers saying that they would not hold the theater liable if they got COVID. Just before this talk, I Googled again and found even more links as many states in the US, including my own, Louisiana, began removing many pandemic restrictions on venues. Our local community theater posted a time-lapse video of their now bare-bones staff delightedly removing all the plastic wrap from the seats that they had blocked off for social distancing for the few live events that they had staged over the past year. For me, and I'm sure for many of you, it is likely not surprising that the emergency here in these articles that's pointed to revolves around the issue of seats and venues. Likely also not surprising that most of these articles are in publications concerned primarily with economics, with the exception of the BMJ blog. The gist of what I perceive to be the central complaint here is, when can we get back to enjoying our entertainments? What is lost, of course, is that the entertainment is chiefly supplied by performing human bodies. As Abbasi subtly gestures, perhaps in all this economic chatter, performers might get a crack at some more ethical treatment, particularly in terms of healthcare. In order to really adequately frame the arguments that I want to make today about sports and theater in relation to precarity and necropolitics, and eventually about collectivity and social justice, I want to give a snapshot of some of the important theoretical and historiographical ground that gets us there. So for me and others, the road to precarity, as Judith Butler and others envision, including Achille Mbembe in his book Necropolitics, you have to go through Foucault's theories of biopower and biopolitics. Biopower, Foucault suggests, came about out of the dispersion of sovereign power amongst various emerging institutions and mechanisms of social governance and surveillance. As part of this process, Foucault argues, citizens, particularly in the 19th century, were increasingly managed by discourses and practices promoted by educational, medical, and cultural institutions and a growing print and media culture. All encouraged regular and repeated engagement with those institutions, like doctor's visits, public schooling, evening workouts, in order to increase an individual's ability to self-manage. This regime of mechanisms bent on managing, regulating, and promoting the living of life, he called biopolitics. The result of the systemic implementation of biopolitics is biopower, increasingly specific ways in which these regulating cultural forces made their way into people's private spheres and practices, especially through imperatives to improve health on a broad population scale. I want to mark here the hegemonic sleight of hand at work in this kind of power. The phrase each and all comes up frequently for Foucault when discussing the shifting art of government, or what he calls governmentality. He describes occurring as we moved into modernity. This emerging form of governing dispersed management responsibilities into populations so that the individuals might focus on the each, on themselves. In doing so, they became easier to guide as an all, as an entire population. As we focus more on what Foucault called these techniques of the self, We will likely focus less on how others outside our immediate spaces are being governed. This maneuver, in turn, makes way for what I find to be the essence of biopower, if it can really be called as such, which comes down to one phrase from Foucault: to make live and let die. Let me unpack that phrase a bit in relation to sport, physical culture, and the performing arts before I return to discussing this focus on the individual to conclude. So modern physical culture and organized sport emerged in concert with this shift in governing structures in the West. Physical culture in particular became part of the biopolitical ensemble of practices meant to enable individuals to work on themselves in order to increase their human capital. Human capital for Foucault is related to an individual's capacity to produce their labor and time as a value or good in and of itself. But more than that, it's about the capacity to produce a quality of life, or to put it simply, happiness. As a result, the shift in modes of governing at this time during the late 19th and early 20th centuries focused not only on wage earning work, you need to work on your body so it doesn't break down in the factory, but also on culturing work. You need to work on your body in order to attain fulfillment in life and transcendence. Physical culture fit neatly into both of these categories, which explains the boom in physical education, fitness, and sports in the latter half of the 19th century in Europe and the US. Sports and the performing arts function primarily in the culturing part of that equation. Audiences attend sporting and performing arts events in order to work on their minds, their souls, their hearts, to become more fully actualized and fulfilled humans, a rough summary of how that equation might go. To bring it back to the example at the beginning of the talk about the articles on sports, arts, affinities popping up during the pandemic, it is in this second mode of biopolitics and biopower, culturing, that is being analyzed in the immediate term as the biggest loss to sports and the arts during the pandemic. Put another way, to bring the Foucault phrase back in, sports and the arts make us feel alive. Patronizing them helps us live our lives to their fullest capacity. It's difficult to argue somehow that that is a bad thing, which of course Foucault points out. It is quite easy to neglect the and of the make live and let die. The and, though, belies the unbreakable relationship between the two parts of that phrase. The each and the all. The make live and let die. Both set up relationships of interdependency that underpin structures of inequity. And in the case of the late 19th and early 20th century, of the eugenics that persist both in our sporting and artistic practices today. Early eugenic rhetoric provided a pivotal synthesis of promoted and acceptable gendered and racialized behavior and coercive techniques that ensured the proliferation of white, middle, and upper class populations and denied those privileges to other non-white and lower class populations. In another paraphrase of the make live and let die, Foucault suggests that modern racism is a manifestation of a form of modern sovereignty with, quote, a power to foster life or disallow it to the point of death, unquote. This biopolitical framework focuses on how the making live and letting die of eugenics outlived its popular but problematic ubiquity to be converted into a pervasive but subterranean ideology of white supremacy. Long disguised in racially neutral terms, its omnipresence regularly reemerges with renewed fervor and ugliness at various times in our history, like our present moment. The sterilizations of individuals in Black and Indigenous communities during the first 3/4 of the 20th century in the US served as a negative type of eugenics, a letting die by forcibly preventing those perceived as unfit by governing institutions from being able to reproduce. What Foucault's definition of racism enables is a more thorough investigation of how positive eugenics, the making live, quote, allows for a hierarchization of those who are worthy of living, but also situates the health of one person in a direct relationship with the disappearance of another, unquote. We find this relationship not only in systems of physical education, like access to gyms, healthy foods, but also in models of representation in the arts and the media as well. We continue to grapple with the inequities in healthcare and vaccine distribution locally and globally, and this equation is then further exposed. This relationship of dependency is at the root of theories of precarity and precarious life, which I'm going to return to here in just a moment. But I do want to linger a moment on how the arts upheld and continue to uphold these same structures of inequity. The arts have a long history of promoting, quote, classicism as self-culture, unquote, as cultural studies scholar Tony Bennett calls it. For example, Bennett suggests that museums were seen as a, quote, improving force of culture, unquote, on the working class at their emergence in the 19th century. As improving forces, culturing institutions like theater, dance, opera, etc., assimilated the white working class into the urban population. Bennett argues, in order to avert the, quote, threat of anarchy, unquote. Culture, Bennett claims, acted as, quote, a moral force through which individuals might improve themselves, unquote. Art, he suggests, could also serve as a culturing force. He argues as those viewing art would strive to, quote, close the gap between their rough empirical selves and the poise and harmony represented by the work of art, unquote. In other words, according to Bennett, cultural institutions and practices help 19th century audiences visualize their ideal selves, and those selves were white, middle class, and mostly male. It should be no surprise that in theater, the rise of cultural institutions happened simultaneously with the rise of realism, a style that presents the ideal, sometimes flawed, but still ideal. The assumption that that mirror for our society, the stage, is almost always showing us a white face, continues to haunt our practices today. In the US, multiple initiatives like the We See You White American Theater Collective have emerged to address this long-term racism, which brings me, at last, to precarity. Precariousness preoccupied much of my initial thoughts on this topic. How could it not? I thought about all my colleagues who work in the arts industry who are now unemployed. I thought about students and colleagues struggling with heretofore manageable mental health issues that are now overwhelmingly incapacitating in the pandemic. I thought about athletes who use their paychecks and platforms to advocate for those in their community and pay the workers laid off at their stadiums, all the while being excoriated to shut up and dribble and do the job they were paid to do. Isn't everything and everyone precarious right now? Delving into precarity theory helped me nuance this sense of overwhelm and refocus the question away from what my colleague likes to call oppression Olympics toward the clear sense of what precariousness means and what its implications might be for sports and the performing arts as we move into the after time. Here I use performance scholars Rebecca Schneider and Nicholas Ridout's expansion of Lauren Berlant's definition of precarity. Quote, if precarity is life lived in relation to someone else's hands, it is also newly experienced by many as life lived in relation to a future that cannot be propped up securely upon the past, unquote. As Berlant points out, the legal term precarious describes, quote, the situation wherein your tenancy on your land is in someone else's hands, unquote. The potency of this particular example shines a light back on the make live and let die of biopower. Here, the person in the position of power over the tenants benefits directly from their overall diminishment. Let me provide a more specific example for our purposes. The NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletics Association, athletes are not paid for their labor. They're given scholarships, not the same as pay, and promises that college play will enhance their value and secure them a bigger paycheck later. Their situation was made even more precarious by the pandemic. For instance, University of Florida basketball player Keontae Johnson collapsed mid-timeout during a game in December. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. 2 months previously, like many other NCAA athletes, he had tested positive for COVID. He's fine. It turns out it was not actually COVID related, but it certainly could have been. An additional stat to know, 49.7% of male college athletes are non-white. The pandemic increased most folks' overall level of precarity. That said, For those that were already in a situation of precarity, COVID made that situation even more dire. While say my level of stability has certainly been shaken, to say it is now on some level of equivalence with those who had been precarious before and are existing even more precariously now would be incorrect. While many of us now have a more intimate experience with precarity, actors forced to move back home with their parents, contract workers pushed into social welfare programs like food stamps, living our lives on screens, others have been given a death sentence. Which brings me to necropolitics. In necropolitics, Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe says the quiet part of biopolitics out loud and brings in Frantz Fanon in order to center the racial implications of biopower. He takes the second part of the make, live, and let die equation and takes out the passivity of letting someone die. To a certain extent, Mbembe might say the equation is actually make die and let live. Pointing to recent global wars, genocides, colonial occupations, and plantations as his central examples, he infuses Foucault with Fanon, Bataille, and Gilroy in order to argue that necropolitics accounts for, quote, the various ways in which in our contemporary world, weapons are deployed in the interest of maximally destroying persons and creating death worlds. That is, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to living conditions that confer upon them the status of the living dead, unquote. For Mbembe, the landscape of the living dead can include a broad swath of environments, from, quote, children blinded by rubber bullets, to buildings that bring back painful memories of humiliation, interrogation, and beatings, unquote. As he says, quote, to live under late modern occupation is to experience a permanent condition of being in pain, unquote. The pandemic has made this imagery even more acute. It is difficult to not see death everywhere. What Mbembe's work lays bare is that this was already happening for globally marginalized communities. The pandemic merely exposed the failures of the neoliberal system to everyone, everywhere, by revealing the inadequacies of our global healthcare systems and the political entanglements that prevent immediate action. So what should we do then? Where are we headed, and how can we, as artists, as teachers, as athletes, as scholars, position ourselves and our students to be prepared for what's to come? At the conclusion of his 2016 book, Mbembe pivots back to the all, of the each and all. He asserts, quote, the 21st century opens onto the avowal about the extreme fragility of all and of the all, capitalized, unquote. Similarly, in her 2015 book, based on a series of lectures, Notes Toward a Performative Theory of Assembly, Judith Butler also points to the necessity of reconceiving of the all in global terms. This necessary unity is, for Butler, driven by the precariousness of our economic, political, and environmental circumstances. In addition, that unity does not require affinity nor affection. She offers, quote, there are, as we know, antagonistic ties, wretched bonds, raging and mournful modes of connectedness, unquote. In this way, neither she nor Mbembe are calling for some kind of universality or neo-humanism. Rather, as Butler suggests, certain ethical obligations that arise out of our, quote, unchosen cohabitation, unquote. She concludes, quote, we live together because we have no choice. And though we sometimes rail against that unchosen condition, we remain obligated to struggle to affirm the ultimate value of that unchosen social world, an affirmation that is not quite a choice, a struggle that makes itself known and felt precisely when we exercise our freedom in a way that is necessarily committed to the equal value of lives, unquote. Her most recent expansion of these ideas last week in Time magazine suggests that the conditions of the pandemic have exposed that tenuous interconnectedness even more. The pandemic, she says, quote, challenges the notion of ourselves as isolated individuals encased in discrete bodies, bound by established borders. And she concludes, as we dismantle the rigid forms of individuality in these interconnected times, we can imagine the smaller part that human worlds must play on this earth, whose regeneration we depend on, unquote. In the performing arts, physical culture, and sports, collective creation is our superpower. I think of my colleague Kimberly Janarone's work on the early fraternal bonds of the Turner societies in Eastern Europe, and the ways that working out together also meant working on overthrowing totalitarian regimes. I think about the way in which student athletes instantly thrive in the group projects in my classes. Collaboration is their ethos. I think about how my student artists instinctively understand the labor involved in a football game. They recognize and value all the work at play every Saturday on the football field at LSU. They fundamentally connect with the idea of team. And these groups also understand the strategic bonds that make such production possible. Both folks understand that they do not have to agree or like each other in order to make the world of the game, the world of the play happen. Now, the show must go on ethic is deeply, deeply problematic. It has created, sustained, and reinforced the very systemic abuse that the arts is now so vociferously disavowing. And in doing so, we need to draw some fine distinctions between casting out abuse and casting out any form of difficulty or disagreement, because that is our strength as artists, as creators, as athletes, as coaches. We weather differences in ideology. We weather differences of ideology, of belief, of personality, in order to benefit a collective creation. To conclude, I want to shift to a bit of a tangential anecdote. So the last few nights, my husband has been rewatching with my family the documentary The Last Dance about Michael Jordan's NBA journey with the Chicago Bulls. Look, dramaturgically speaking, this is a super tight documentary. It mobilizes so many dramatic devices like the flashback and the montage, classical biblical allegories, like the Jordan story is totally a Christ story. In the heady environment of my life of late that has been this talk, I couldn't help but see it as a story that challenges the individualistic narrative of most sports celebrities. He is catapulted by his superhuman talent, and then his body and outside forces bring him back down to the status of mere mortal. But that is not what the story is about. The action follows Jordan's evolving relationship to himself and the sport by tracing his choice to move away from embracing individual superstardom to finding fulfillment and growth and working with and through his teammates. Yes, it can easily tilt toward the cliched, there is no I in team moralism, but it avoids that. As the series moves along, it shifts from focusing solely on Jordan to highlighting the work, growth, and stories of his teammates like Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman, and the arduous work that happened behind the scenes in team management. We watched Jordan's unscripted reactions to the questions posed by the interviewer behind the camera, his in-the-moment reaction to his mother reading a letter he wrote home from college, his gruff response to former Detroit Piston Isaiah Thomas's retelling of an infamous moment at the end of a playoff game. We see his deep, deep feeling about the team that he helped build, not necessarily because he's close with all of his former teammates, or that he even really held affection for them, but because he is moved by their collective creation that was the Bulls franchise at that time. I want to suggest that sports and the performing arts might have some keys to this idea of cohabitation that Butler marks. A path for us to get along, even when we don't get along. That these narratives might provide ways in which we can dismantle white supremacist models of individualism that threaten to privilege the each over the all. Thank you.